Alright guys, welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to be talking about detraining, and specifically we're going to go over three types of detraining. We're going to go over cardiovascular detraining, strength detraining, and hypertrophy detraining. But before the video gets started, if you guys do learn something new and if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to subscribe and also give it a like. It means the world to me. And without further ado, let's get started with the video. Alright, so to start off, I think it's important that we define detraining. So exactly what is detraining? And the best definition that I was able to find is the following: losing muscular and cardiovascular adaptations due to the lack of exercise and stimuli. So this pretty much means that any adaptations that your body makes, whether they're cardiovascular, strength, or hypertrophy adaptations, your body would get rid of them if they're not in use. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just what your body does to make sure that you're not wasting energy on things that are not necessary. Quick little note that I wanted to add: detraining is not always a bad thing. There's actually pro-grade athletes that use detraining to give their bodies a rest. Even in some recovery therapy, there's times where detraining is used to help prevent an imbalance or treat an injury. So detraining does have its time and purpose. It's not always a bad thing, and if it's used correctly, it could actually help your training a lot. So let's get started with the first type of detraining, which is going to be cardiovascular detraining. When it comes to cardiovascular detraining, there's a lot of studies out there, but a lot of them concise the same point, that just a week or two of no training at all is not really going to hinder your performance or your VO2 max. For example, there was a recent study that was using 20 soccer players, pro-grade soccer players. 10 of them continued their training for 3 weeks, while the other 10 actually did no training for 3 weeks. And what they found was that after that 3-week period, their VO2 maxes were pretty much identical. So nothing really changed. That being said, those are pro-grade players. The average person is not a pro-grade soccer player that has dedicated their whole life to a cardiovascular endurance sport. So what does that mean for the average person? Well, a study by Charles Pedler that was done on recreational runners compared a group of people that went through a 16-week training course preparing for a marathon, and then followed them 8 weeks after their training program, in which they did no cardiovascular endurance training. So after 4 weeks, they noticed a significant change in plasma volume. What they noticed was an 8.1% in left ventricle wall thickness and a 10.3% drop in left ventricle mass. And that remained constant up until the 8th week, where they also noticed that the right ventricle chamber size also dropped by 8%. Again, that goes back to the same point that we brought up at the beginning. The reason why your body loses muscle mass or loses strength or loses any sort of adaptation is because it's just easier to maintain your body at its bare minimum than it is with extra adaptations that you don't need. So now when we talk about strength gains, right, that seems to be the thing that we gain the fastest, but we also lose the fastest. And there's actually a reason for that. So there's been a recent study that actually compared what 14 days of detraining did for strength athletes. And the results were pretty interesting actually. From 1 rep max that was tested at the beginning of the trial to their 1 rep max that was tested 14 days after the beginning of the trial, the differences were pretty minimal. In the bench press, there was a drop of 1.7%, 0.9 in the squat, and although they didn't necessarily mention the deadlift, they did mention that in knee extension movements, they measured a drop between 2.3 to 7%, which just shows you how within 2 weeks of not training, the drops can be pretty minimal. There was another study done in people that were used to training 3 times a week that went to 8 weeks of no training at all. And in that study, when they measured the EMG activity, they actually noticed that there was little to no change in their 1 rep max. At least according to that study, their changes were insignificant. And I do want to bring up a point here too, where someone by the name of Blair Wheels, maybe you guys are very familiar with him, he did mention in a recent video that after every training cycle, he actually goes 2 months without training. And for him, that's totally normal. And when he comes back, he mentions how he comes back feeling better than ever and well rested. That is true for a lot of pro-grade athletes. And I just want to mention that in his case, as he's also been very open about, he is using PEDs, which hinder at the rate in which your body recovers, and they also allow you to maintain muscle mass with minimal effort. It's not to say that you don't need to put in the work to get that type of strength or that size, but your body just reacts a little different when you're under the influence of those drugs. Lastly, something that probably applies to a lot of us is what happens when the average person goes a long period of time without training. A recent study by Hakkinen reported that after 3 months of detraining, on average, there was about 15.8% loss in strength across all 3 major lifts. This is pretty significant, but at the same time, you gotta consider this is 3 months of zero strength training. This could be subjective because for someone that tried to be physically active throughout the quarantine, if you did some sort of training, even if it wasn't necessarily strength training, you might have been able to retain some of your strength. Remember, it's all about keeping those adaptations. While you might not be able to train at the high intensity and volume that you were before, if you keep bringing that stimulus to your muscles are gonna retain some of those satellite cells. If you wanted to put a more numeric value to how fast you can lose your strength, that study brings up how anywhere from 0.3 to 0.8% of strength is lost every week, but that seemed to only be true up to 32 weeks. After the 32nd week, it seemed like strength loss were just kind of exponential. Going back to the topic of staying active during quarantine, I'll use myself for an example. I try to stay more or less active throughout the quarantine with whatever little equipment I had before I was able to put a home gym together. And I was able to accomplish a PR on the deadlift that was only 10 pounds short of my pre-quarantine PR. So simply because I stayed active and I kept the same muscle group stimulated, I was able to maintain more or less my strength. I did drop my strength, which is 10 pounds, but again, if we take into consideration what the research shows, that's more or less in line with how much strength I was capable of losing within those couple months. The last thing we're going to talk about is hypertrophy detraining and how fast you can lose your hypertrophy gains. So a lot of studies on this topic are done on professional grade bodybuilders, in which they've shown that after 13 weeks of no training at all, they've only lost about 6% muscle fiber density. Now when you do the math, this breaks out to about like 0.4% per week, which is really nothing. That is something that is not applicable to the average person, to the recreational gym goer, someone that exercises on a regular basis, but is not taking it to a bodybuilder level. That being said, what does that mean for the average person? There's a lot of studies showing that within the first couple weeks, muscle fiber density actually does not change a significant amount. What does happen is that the fact that you're not exercising and you're not sweating as much helps you retain more sodium, thus you retain more water, and it gives you that little puffier look. It's not necessarily that you got fat or that you lost your gains, it's just that your body is retaining more water. That's why after a few days back at the gym, maybe a week or two, you sweat all that water out and you're back to looking exactly how you were before. Say someone that's an endurance athlete, like a marathon runner, a soccer player, or even if you train enough to not be considered just a recreational gym goer, you're very dedicated to actually going to the gym, but you're not in that pro bodybuilder level. The study shows that up to 3 weeks, there was actually no loss in muscle fiber density. So it's not all bad news, right? We already went over those cardiovascular adaptations, how fast can you lose strength adaptations, and how fast can you lose hypertrophy adaptations. But it's not all bad. Let's not end it on a bad note. The reality is that you can gain it all back, and that is thanks to muscle memory. Now, muscle memory is going to get a video on its own because it's a very broad topic and there's a lot of points to go at. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to just briefly touch on it. Well, studies show that you can gain up to 1, maybe 2 pounds per week until you get to your previous muscle mass weight. It's not to say that you'll just exponentially gain 1 to 2 pounds of muscle per week if you detrain. Now, I just want to point out what the old idea of gaining muscle was like, and it was to the point where you would exercise, which would provide a stimulus, your muscles would adapt, add satellite cells, and grow, but then the moment you stop, you would go through cell death. That is not the case. That model has been thrown away, is no longer looked at as a reliable model. The model that we now look at is the one that states that if you're detrained and you apply a stimulus, which means you train, your muscles would grow. Once you remove that stimulus or that training factor, your satellite cells and your muscles, for lack of a better word, they shrink just so that they don't require as much energy to be maintained. Now, once you reintroduce that stimulus and that adaptation, your satellite cells would, again, for lack of a better word, they'll just expand and grow bigger, and now you're back to where you were. Although there's no actual numerical value to how fast you can gain what adaptations you've lost, because there's a lot of physiological factors that play into it as far as diet and your DNA makeup. There is some studies that show a pattern. That pattern, as I mentioned earlier, is between 1 to 2 pounds per week. If you go through a detraining period like a lot of us have, it's not the end of the world. You can gain all of it back. You just have to be patient. You have to apply the correct amount of stimuli, make sure you diet at some point, and then you'll gain it before you realize it. Overall, I hope you guys did learn something new. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys did, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're putting videos out every week. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next time.